Welcome. I'm Michael Dukes, Director, Center for Land Use Efficiency, UF-IFAS. And today you are joining us at our fourth installment of our Landscape Summit, which is happening every Wednesday at 1 o'clock. Last week we had talks on alternative ground covers and biodiversity, so that's going to segue really nicely into our talks today, I think. And we have two speakers today. Put your questions at any time in the chat and we will address those after each speaker. Also, our recorded sessions from the last, I think from the first two are available. If Emily, if you'll put that up in a link to that in the chat so people can see that, and we'll have blog posts coming out on each of these very soon. So to kick this off, let's get started with our first speaker is going to be Dr. Chris Marble. Chris is an assistant professor in ornamental and landscape weed management, specializing in invasive weed management. And his primary goal is to improve upon current weed control practices using an integrated approach that combines both chemical and non-chemical management strategies. He's got a PhD in horticulture from Auburn University. Our second speaker after Chris is Dr. Kevin Kenworthy. He's a professor in agronomy, specializing in breeding and genetics. Kevin, I got this off your bio online. I think it's safe to say mainly turfgrass, if not exclusively. I'll let you hit that when you get on. But he specializes in breeding to develop turfgrass cultivars that require fewer inputs but still maintain high quality. And he developed the turfgrass, the name I couldn't think of at our first session, and that's CitraBlue, which he'll talk about some of that today. He has a PhD in plant breeding and genetics from Oklahoma State University. With that, Chris, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Michael. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in today. So I'm Chris Marble. I'm going to be talking today about reducing herbicide use and improving weed control through different integrated weed management practices. So just like Michael was talking about, basically utilizing a combination of non-chemical and chemical control so that we can get better weed control with less inputs, and that might be herbicides or just maintenance costs. So first, just to give you an overview of what I'm going to be talking about today, I'll give you a little bit of an introduction into the industry in terms of weed management and landscapes and kind of how that is done, and give everyone, if you're not familiar, a little bit of background information on that. I'll also talk about the importance of weed management, and then advantages and disadvantages of different practices, and then kind of the way that weeds are being managed now, the current methods of weed control in both planting beds and in turfgrass, and then the challenges that are associated with that, and then some potential solutions that we're trying to come up with through research, looking at different ways that weeds could be managed using a more integrated or holistic approach. So the importance of weed management, we might possibly have to manage weeds. So a lot of homeowners will have to, just based upon HOA guidelines and things like that, regardless really of their preferences. But of course, weeds, the primary reason that we're going to be wanting to control weeds on a landscape situation, it's not really a competition issue, but mostly an aesthetic issue and individual preferences. Weeds can definitely cause competitive issues. There's been studies that weeds can reduce the growth of ornamentals up to 60%. And if an area isn't kept weed free, it can increase establishment time, especially of smaller shrubs, by over 100%. So essentially doubling the time that it takes for that plant to become established. And then from an economic standpoint, weeds can definitely reduce property values. Some studies have suggested that weed growth and then also invasive plants can reduce the value of a property by up to 15%. And then, of course, there's also environmental aspects of weed management that should also be considered, such as reducing the spread of invasive plants, which is probably the most important method, or the most important reason that we want to control weeds. Controlling those noxious species that can really cause a lot of problems if they were to get out into those natural areas. And then increasing weeds can increase mowing frequency, which that creates a lot of issues. Weeds can also increase the fertility needs of turfgrass and ornamental plants, and they can also increase irrigation needs and allow plants to not be able to use water as efficiently. And then lastly, some weeds can be toxic or harmful. My least favorite weed is the sand spurs and things like that that are just a pain, and so we've got to control those because it can make areas unusable for their intended purpose. So just to give an overview of the industry, to give everyone a little bit of background information, there's basically doing a search on FDAX, you come up with about 4,000 different companies that have some sort of pest control operation associated with them. They have some sort of pest management license. In most cases, the weed control is performed by pest control companies. So essentially the people that are out there, they might treat turf grass and planting beds. That company might also, do basically the termite control and things like that. There's also a lot of landscape maintenance companies that might also control weeds and planting beds, and that would be kind of what we call the people with the quote unquote Roundup license, basically a limited landscape maintenance license. So a lot of times those are the companies that are doing the mowing and the maintenance, and then they might also manage weeds in those planting beds just with spot applications of post-emergence herbicides. And then generally these weed control practices, they're based upon the company and kind of the different contracts that are out there, but they're basically set on schedules. So most companies are going to operate where they'll visit a site bi-weekly, monthly, quarterly, et cetera, depending upon the needs and the value dollar of those different maintenance contracts. So the current methods of weed control in these different areas. So in turf applications, all the companies that I've talked to and work with, they're predominantly only using post-emergence herbicides. And those are often applied on a schedule. So they'll go out and say they're visiting a site monthly. They'll go out and possibly spot spray post-emergence herbicides on a monthly basis. And then they might also offer services where if a homeowner notices weeds and they come up and they escape that control, they'll come back and retreat if there's a weed control failure or something like that. And in most cases, companies are utilizing tank mixes, or basically a combination of different herbicides at each application, typically more than one active ingredient. And sometimes it just depends upon the company, but sometimes they're not really selecting herbicides based upon the weed species that are present in a site. It's typically something that's going to be fairly broad spectrum. In turfgrass, it will be something that's going to have activity on broadleaf and sedge weeds, and then in planting beds, typically a non-selective herbicide, in most cases glyphosate. There are very few new actives coming on board. All the new herbicides that are basically coming available for use in this market are essentially just different combinations of older chemistries. A lot of these chemistries have been off patent for 20 or 30 years, and so the different companies to control or manage different weeds, they'll change different ratios and make different combinations of these older chemistries. And then beds, like I talked about earlier, they're typically spot sprayed with just glyphosate. That's almost exclusively used, or at least it used to be before a lot of the recent controversy that's come out. But basically, when they come out to possibly mow or perform other maintenance services, they would spot spray weeds as needed with those non-selective post-emergence herbicides. And there's really little to no pre-emergence herbicide use, whether that's in planting beds or in turfgrass. Some companies definitely utilize those, but in some cases, some of the more effective pre-emergence herbicides might be cost prohibitive for some companies, and so they're typically not used, and post-emergence herbicides are used predominantly. So what do these different companies have control over? Most companies that are offering the weed management or pest management services, they do have control over fertilization. They're often applying fertilizer and doing the pest management, especially if they have the contract and they're controlling the weeds in turfgrass. But very few companies, if they're strictly out there to perform the pest management, a lot of them don't have control over irrigation scheduling, amounts, and they might not have any say-so in terms of how that turf is managed. So in terms of the mowing height or the frequency of that, and they don't really, if they don't have good communication with their client, they're not going to really know when those processes are happening. And so that's a very big challenge, because a lot of herbicides can definitely be affected and lose efficacy if they're not watered in, or if their irrigation's timed improperly, or for example, if someone mows right soon before or after certain post-emergence herbicides are applied. And then a lot of them have very little say-so or control in plant species selection or the maintenance. So things like mulching or just selecting species for a site. So the right plant, right place. A lot of these pest control companies don't really have much input into that. So challenges like the ones I just talked about, there's not a lot of effective herbicides. In planting beds, the big reason and the big challenge in planting beds in terms of weed management is that there's mixed plantings. It's very difficult to find a herbicide that's going to be safe to use, in that entire planting bed. And then these companies are, they're route based, so they have limited visits to the site. It's not something where they can really go out and scout, all these different areas that they have. They can't go there, on a weekly basis in most cases and still be profitable. And then a lot of times too, a lot of these companies have a high turnover rate, so they don't have employees that are there for an extended period of time, or it might be difficult to keep and retain employees that are well trained and very experienced. We talked about the fact that there's not any really new herbicides, so we've got to find options that are outside of that herbicide realm. And then a big challenge for us in Florida is that we're in Florida where weeds come to grow. Florida is excellent, at providing a perfect environment for a lot of these weed species to thrive. And especially in Central and South Florida, we really don't have any kind of break. These warm season weeds can just grow essentially all year round. So an overview of some of the objectives that I've looked at in my program. One is reducing the problem at one of the initial sources, so in production. This talk is going to focus mostly on landscape weed control, but we do a lot of work on the production side. And so just to give everyone an example of how integrated weed management can be successful, I'll show a few of those examples to start off. And then developing a different herbicide strategy to prevent resistance, and then the total herbicide amount that applied, and then the cost of those herbicide applications. Sometimes we want to reduce herbicide applications, but to do that, we might just need to select a different herbicide or a different method of application, and we can really reduce that number of herbicides that are being applied on a yearly basis. And so we'll talk about some of those research results. We've done a lot of work with mulch and planting beds. That's really the primary method of weed control. And so we'll talk about mulch selection, and then basically optimizing mulch use for weed control in those areas. And then finally, I'll just share some findings from other researchers on the benefits of integrated weed management. There's been a lot of work that's been done to really quantify the benefit of different integrated weed management practices, especially in turfgrass, which I don't work in. So controlling weeds at the source. So this is some of the work that we've been doing in nursery containers, and this would be more on the production side. But one of the big things that we've been looking at over the last several years is basically strategic fertilizer placement. So when a plant is produced in a container nursery, the fertilizer is going to be either top dressed or incorporated in almost all cases. Those are the predominant methods that's easier to apply. There's other methods of fertilization that are less utilized in the industry because they do take a little bit more time up front, and that will be something like the dibble, basically placing that fertilizer in a small area where it's able to reach the plant roots, but a lot of that area of that container doesn't contain any fertilizer. And then subdressing, or essentially placing fertilizer in a single layer beneath the surface of that container. You can see an example of a subdress pot here. So these are just some of the results that we've seen through strategically placing fertilizer. And again, this is in container nurseries, but this just really shows an example of the success that these different non-chemical strategies can have in a lot of different cases. So we look at the counts and the germination of these different weed species. In this case, we were looking at eclipta, crabgrass, and spurge. And then you have the counts here, the number of mature weeds that grew to maturity and basically flowered. And these are the averages here. And so you see and all these different fertilizer placements really there were very few differences with the different species, regardless of how those fertilizers were incorporated. The weeds germinated just fine, and we had fairly high germination rates in all those different placements. But then you go over and you look at the shoot dry weight, so basically the biomass of those different species, and that's where you really see a tremendous drop off between the two industry standard methods, which are the incorporation, which is represented by this blue bar, and then top dress, which is this red bar. And then you look at the subdress, dibble, and then the no fertilizer, which essentially, in a lot of cases, we would get up to 80 to even 98% reduction in shoot dry weight by using those alternative fertilizer placements. No herbicides were applied to these plots. The only thing that was different was that the fertilizer was placed in the pot in a different manner. And then in these cases, when we screened them against ornamental plants, no difference in ornamental plant growth. Here's just an example of kind of how this works. So here's a bunch of eucalyptus seedlings at the top of the container here. That's a common container nursery weed. Those roots will never mature and reach down that layer of fertilizer, but they germinate just fine, but they'll never reach maturity. And so you don't have that competition issue there. Another thing that we've been looking at in containers is stratification. So essentially looking at using different pine bark particle sizes to control weeds. And this will kind of lead into the mulch work that we've done. But basically the idea here is using larger particle materials at the top part of the container that hold less water and don't provide a very good environment for weeds to germinate. And so in these cases, using these stratified substrates, just basically changing the particle size of the pine bark, we're getting 100% weed reduction in a lot of cases. Here's bittercress here. This was about 75% reduction. And then with liverwort, which is it's a weed species in nurseries, but it's very sensitive to cultural conditions. And we never got any liverwort growth on any of the pots that were stratified. So, and here's just an example. This is the data here. Plumbago growth. This is one of the ornamentals that we looked at. No difference in the growth of the standard substrates and the stratified substrates. And then essentially over a 98% reduction in liverwort growth in all the stratified substrates where we use those different particle sizes. And so that kind of goes into the work that we've done looking at different mulch types. Oftentimes when people will ask me in terms of which is a good mulch to use for weed management, they're looking at type. And type really isn't that important. You want to look at the different characteristics of the mulch and essentially the physical properties of that mulch. And so that's one thing that we've been looking at. So this slide here just shows the mechanisms of control that mulch will provide, and everybody's probably familiar with this. It'll provide a physical barrier, reduces light, then reduces available water. These two here, so providing a physical barrier and reducing light, those are going to be most effective on basically the existing seeds that are beneath that mulch layer, so the seeds that are already in that seed bank. When we reduce available water within that mulch layer, that's going to be effective for those seeds. That's going to be the most important thing because most of the weed seeds are going to be basically introduced over time on top of that mulch layer in most cases. So just to look at the different things that we've looked at for different mulch types. So in this study here, we looked at pine straw, hardwood, and pine bark over a growing season. Really, we got over about 9% light reduction at all these different depths from 1 inch to 4 inch, and there was no difference in basically light transmittance through that mulch layer when we applied at least 1 inch of mulch. But at ½ inch, that's when you start to run into some issues. So essentially what this is showing is that it doesn't take a lot of mulch to reduce light, but then I'll show you why those other characteristics are important here in these coming slides. This is probably the most important thing. So this moisture holding capacity, and this is really what is most affected by how the mulch is processed and kind of the different characteristics of the mulch. So here we've got two shredded wood products, melaleuca and eucalyptus mulch. Very effective at weed control, but you look at this moisture retention. So this is at 0 hours after an irrigation event down to 24 hours. And you look at the percent moisture that those two shredded wood materials are holding, it's about twice that of pine bark and pine straw, which have larger particle sizes, and they allow mulch to drain faster and then also evaporate through them faster. So they're holding a lot less moisture. So that means they're going to be more effective when weed seeds are introduced on top of that. There's not going to be any difference in terms of those different mulches providing a physical barrier, though. So that does provide an advantage for things like pine bark and pine straw that have those characteristics of draining very fast. Here's just a breakdown of the particle size analysis of those. You see with the pine bark and then the pine straw, those particle sizes, they're predominantly in these larger sizes, so about a 1/2 inch and above when we run it through basic soil seed. So much larger particle sizes than the different hardwoods that we looked at, which are essentially most of those particle sizes are below 1/2 inch, so they are holding much more moisture. So this is just kind of how this plays out when you look at weed growth when seeds are placed below the mulch. So existing weeds, they're not going to be any difference. Like I talked about, they're all going to provide us the same physical barrier, and they're all going to really, there's not going to be any difference in the ability of those different mulch materials to block out light. But when you look at the weed seeds that are introduced on top, those shredded mulch particles that are smaller in particle size, that hold more moisture, they're going to allow weed seeds to grow actually and germinate on top of that mulch layer, like you have with this hardwood. This is a shredded wood material here compared to pine bark and pine straw. And then this is no mulch. So no difference in those, and the no mulch when the weeds were actually introduced above that layer. But this is what kind of bring the idea home. So this is mulch type versus physical properties. When we looked at the different mulch materials as they were purchased, so if you're just comparing different types, typically would see better weed control with pine bark. This is a wood chip, not a shredded wood material, so those perform better. But we did have differences in all these different mulch types. We looked at, in this particular study, there was 5 different mulch types. But what happens with those different mulch types when we basically process those and screen them so they all have similar physical characteristics? Then there's no difference in the weed control of those mulches when they're applied at a similar depth. Then the only thing that matters is the depth. So a lot of these mulch materials could be processed differently possibly and improve the weed control, especially in those smaller particle materials or those shredded materials that do hold a lot of moisture. Herbicides can definitely be applied to improve control of weeds. So, and herbicides are intercepted. That's what this slide is for, is just to show the interception of herbicides on mulch materials. With pine bark here, you can see that there's weed growth when we remove the mulch, basically showing that herbicides were binding to that mulch material. Same thing with pine straw, it moved through that mulch much better, and with hardwood, it binded to that mulch material here. So we had much less, much better weed control when we used herbicides with the pine straw in terms of the herbicide. Not much of it binded to that pine straw. The reason for that is basically that pine straw, when you look at a 2-inch layer of pine straw, it's mostly air. There's not as much solid material with that pine straw because it is airier than those other materials. So a lot of the time when people say, should I use herbicides with mulch? Is that going to provide any benefit? Doesn't the herbicide just bind with the mulch? And yes, it does. And it's actually binding on top of that mulch, but that can still provide a benefit, as you see here when we actually applied the mulch on top and we looked at seeds placed on top of the mulch. In this case, this was pine bark mini nuggets, 1-inch layer of mulch plus herbicide, 2-inch plus herbicide, and then 2-inch and no herbicide when the seeds were placed on top. So you still do get a benefit, because if that weed seed is able to germinate within that mulch layer, the presence of that herbicide, even if it didn't reach the soil, can still provide a benefit. And so that can reduce maintenance costs over time. And then another thing to consider too when we're looking at weed control in these areas is the efficacy of the different herbicides, and including those pre-emergence herbicides in with our applications. So these are the standard herbicides that people are using: spot spraying, glyphosate alone, and glufosinate, which is phenolic, but those are often used in planting beds with no pre-emergence herbicides, just spot spray. And so essentially, if a company is just using these post-emergence herbicides to keep less than 20% weed coverage, they're going to need somewhere between 12 and 16 applications per year. If we include a pre-emergence herbicide like indaziflam or prodiamine, we can reduce that by more than 50%. We're getting 2 applications, 4 applications, et cetera. So we're cutting it in more than half if we just include those pre-emergence herbicides in with those applications. So pre-emergence herbicides can really, you're adding more chemicals to the mix, but you're reducing the total amount of chemical that is actually applied in those areas. This is just a quick slide to show that mulch by itself can provide better weed control than herbicides alone. So this is cost over a year if that mulch layer was kept at a 2-inch layer. And then we looked at hand weeding costs, so if hand weeding was actually performed. But essentially the take home from this slide here is that mulch is very effective. If you add the herbicide to it, this is straw plus herbicide versus straw alone, bark plus herbicide versus bark alone. There is a little bit of a benefit, but the mulch is actually going to perform 1 application or 2 applications of mulch is going to outperform 6 applications of this particular pre-emergence herbicide that we use, which was a soxaben plus trifluralin granular product. But the mulch by itself is going to be much more effective than a pre-emergence herbicide in the absence of that mulch. So these non-chemical methods can be more effective than chemical methods. This is one thing that we need to be aware of too when we're looking at herbicides. So definitely not going to get into the glyphosate issue, but we have been looking at glyphosate alternatives, basically looking at a lot of different contact herbicides that can be used in the same way as glyphosate. Essentially, this is the control at 4 weeks. So here's your glyphosate, and then here's all these different products that are basically used in the same way. Some of those are organic, but very good weed control at 4 weeks. So with these 3 different very common weed species, crabgrass, garden spurge, and oxalis, not much difference between those and glyphosate at a 4-week time frame. But then when we get to 12 weeks, we have significant regrowth, and the growth of those species really increases, and so our control basically plummets after about the 8-week mark. And so when we are looking at alternatives, we do need to consider the efficacy, and possibly when we're using these different glyphosate alternatives, different herbicide alternatives, basically we don't want to just rely on one herbicide, but incorporation of those pre-emergence herbicides, like I talked about before, can really reduce the total herbicide load. And it's going to be even more important to use those herbicides and mulch and these other non-chemical methods when we lose, or if someone can't use something like glyphosate, which is going to be a more effective herbicide than a lot of these other options. And so just real quickly to sum it up, just to look at the different cultural practices and how they affect weeds in turfgrass. So this is doveweed response to soil moisture. This is just a nice graph here showing how doveweed will increase as irrigation amounts basically increase, or percent fill capacity increases. So when we go out there and we preach these different turf maintenance practices and how they, basically improve everything, disease, insect, and weeds, the weed part, and well, the other ones too, but it's definitely quantifiable, and we can actually show and demonstrate that. Here's dollarweed response to irrigation. So conditional watering, so that would be the recommended practice versus daily watering. Basically, dollarweed would just plummet because it's a weed that's very sensitive to cultural conditions. And so can we manage weeds in turfgrass with just cultural conditions? And we can definitely reduce those and control a lot of species like that. But there's going to be some kind of weed that's going to be able to thrive in whatever kind of environment that we create. And that's kind of what this slide is showing here. So these are different mowing heights, 2.5, 3.5, and 4.5 inches, and then 4 different weed species. And so you see how these different weed species are going to thrive at these different mowing heights. So just increasing the mowing height, that doesn't decrease all of these weeds, or increasing the mowing height is not going to increase all the weeds. Different weeds are going to be able to thrive in whatever kind of environment that we create. So it's very important to manage that turf grass the way that it's intended to be managed using those proper maintenance practices, because that's going to help the turfgrass the best and really reduce or increase the competition with weeds, because these turfgrass species that we use in Florida, they're going to be a lot more competitive than a lot of the weeds that are out there that we're battling. So overall, the point of this was just to show people to take a holistic approach. There's not going to be any magic bullet. Mulch type, we've seen is not as critical as depth and then how that mulch is processed. And then herbicides, they will bind with mulch, but they can still improve weeds and reduce the total number of post-emergent herbicides and the total amount of herbicides that are applied over time with those pre-emergence and residual herbicides. And then we have to consider efficacy and incorporating these different herbicides that are more effective. We really can reduce costs over time if we make that initial investment. I already talked about proper turf maintenance is going to reduce the growth of basically all weeds just by the sheer fact that it increases turfgrass growth. And then as educators, the people that are on this call that talk, we need to talk more about training and demonstrating cost and aesthetic benefits of these different cultural practices, because it's easy to say, you know, it causes a lot of environmental benefits, and it does. But if we focus on costs and things that are important to a lot of these companies, we can show that they can reduce their costs, they can increase profits and things like that by following these different maintenance practices. The environmental benefits will follow after that. And then a big challenge, that one thing that we need to figure out how we can do is increase communication between these maintenance companies and the pest control companies when they're not, you know, when a property has two different operations basically maintaining it, because they, if we were to combine those and they were all following, or they were all on the same page, you'd have a lot better control overall. And then that's all that I have here. I know I ran over a little bit of time, but I'm happy to take any questions that we might have.
Great. Thanks, Chris. As always, a wealth of knowledge that is practical and applicable. I'll just get right into the questions. Scrolling back up to one of the first ones, there was some clarification needed on the, I'll just read it to you. The lawn and ornamental license, not O&T, that is for agricultural only. I don't know if you can clarify the.
Yeah, L&O. So I probably have the wrong thing. Basically, I was just referring to the L&O license. So
right,
the difference between someone that can treat turfgrass and someone that can only treat planting beds with caution label products.
Gotcha. This actually ties into one of our earlier seminars, seminar from last week. Do you have suggestions for weed control in a mixed forb lawn? I don't know if you saw the talk last week on alternative ground covers, but the idea is you mix in with turf grass, you mix in some alternative ground covers.
Yeah, so we've done a lot of work with alternative ground covers. The challenge arises when you have a mixture of species there. So if it's one species of a ground cover, like let's say Asiatic jasmine, we can do a pretty good job of controlling weeds in that, or say that it's even perennial peanut, which is a lot more sensitive to herbicides. We can do a pretty good job of controlling weeds in that. But when you have mixtures of species, that's when it becomes more challenging. But still, with a lot of these alternative ground covers, which I think we've looked at maybe 5 or 6 now, and wasn't able to attend last week, so I'm not sure exactly sure what all species were covered. But essentially, with a lot of the broadleaf ground cover species, the issue that we have is controlling broadleaf weeds selectively. So we can control grasses and sedges almost very easily, but the broadleaf weed control is a lot more challenging. But we can use pre-emergence herbicides on a lot of these species also.
All right. Let's see. Strategic fertilizer placement might aid in growth and health and reduce weeds. Would that limit root growth and expansion of the ornamental plants?
So we haven't seen that with the species that we looked at, but admittedly we have looked at pretty fast growing ornamentals, just because we looked at things like plumbago, for example, that is a pretty tough ornamental plant in terms of it grows fast and it has good root growth, and several others. just because we knew that with these different methods, if it's not going to be effective on those, it's not going to be effective on some of the more sensitive species. So that's something that we'll start to look at, where we'll start to look at this with different ornamentals. I know that other people have looked at these, especially the alternative placements with things like azaleas, and there's probably about 45 or 50 different ornamental plants in the literature that have been evaluated with a dibble or subdress type fertilizer placement with no difference in growth between a top dress or incorporation method, whichever one they were compared to in those studies.
Does the pine bark and pine straw raise the pH too much for some plants?
I wouldn't raise the pH or decrease the pH.
Question is raise, maybe.
So I wouldn't think so. I mean, I've never seen, me personally, I definitely haven't tested mulch on every species, but I've never seen, any kind of issue with pine bark or pine straw, specifically with, especially woody ornamental plants. I know pansies and some other things can be sensitive to pine straw, but I haven't really seen it with pine bark. But another one of these things to look at with these different mulch materials too is that if a lot of them are used fresh, which most of the ones that you buy commercially or in bags or have delivered from a landscape supply company, they're going to be aged for some period of time, and that really can depend. But the fresh materials, you can run into issues with certain, especially bedding plants that can be very sensitive. I know pansies are one that they've seen issues with pine straw, but I haven't personally seen it, especially with the landscape plants that will be there permanently, like the woodies and things like that.
All right. In the stratification test with plumbago, did you quantify the plant health? What was the watering regime?
All the plants were watered in the same amount in that particular study. To quantify plant health, there was a marketability rating that was done basically monthly, and then plant growth was collected monthly. And then at the conclusion, I think the data that I showed there was shoot weights and root ratings, etc. So that's all we did for the ornamentals, basically looking at the marketability of the plant and the growth over time.
What effect does planting distance between plants have on weed control? And this is a related question of mine. What effect does landscape design have on weed control?
Yes, so this is a big one. We haven't looked at this in research, but other people have. But this is just kind of something to consider and think about. Okay, so for planting size, so one thing you wouldn't. So when we put plants closer together, you can have a benefit because light is a big factor, in weed growth, etc., and competition as well. So it really just depends upon the species. So let's say you had a bunch of trying to think of the name of the dwarf junipers that can kind of be used as a ground cover. But these dwarf species or things that are planted close together, those can have a benefit if there is a lot of not really, not overplanted, but basically planted in the fact that when they matured, there would be very few gaps, and it would kind of be a continuous cover on the ground, essentially planting them like it was a ground cover. So that can really help with weed control. The issue arises when you have to go in there, and if you do have an escape of certain species, so a lot of weeds can grow with little to no light, and they'll come up, and then that can be a lot more challenging to treat with herbicides. And then also with some of these ornamental plants, let's say it was a shrub that you're not blocking out a lot of light and things like that with those, like some woody shrubs. So you're not going to really provide a benefit by planting those close together, and then you run into some disease issues and stuff like that. So properly spacing those. You wouldn't want to just basically base plant spacing unless it was like a ground cover type situation. You wouldn't really try to space plants for weed management benefits. But one thing that could be important is looking at designing landscapes for weed control purposes. Let's say, for example, ornamental grasses. You can use a lot more in different herbicides with ornamental grasses than you can with a lot of broadleaf plants. So if there was a way to group these plants based upon their herbicide tolerances, that would at least give you a chemical option when you had a weed control failure with mulch or something like that. So spacing those where different areas of the landscape could be treated, and you didn't have, for example, very sensitive herbaceous plants next to some ornamental grasses that were a lot more tolerant to different things. So design it like that. If someone could make that look where it was aesthetically pleasing, there could be some benefits to that.
Great. And next week, we will have a couple speakers on landscape design. So tune back in. Here's an interesting one. Have you visited are you aware of any research regarding electrical weed control originally explored in the 80s and 90s?
I've read some of those papers on that. I don't know of any in particular that's going on right now. They did find some interesting things with that. And then there was a paper that came out in, I think, 2014 or so, which is the latest one that I've seen, where they looked at basically flame weeding on different surfaces and basically different species response to those. But a lot of those, I mean, a lot of those practices can be done, and they can be done pretty effectively. But just like with everything else, there can be species differences with those. And so it really just depends upon the weed spectrum that's at a place, which one will be more effective. In general, with those different methods, broadleaf weeds are going to be more sensitive than sedges or grasses, which tend to recover a lot better.
Right. Brooke, we're getting to your question here. I see you asked it a couple times. I'm curious if there's a pre-emergent that could be used to help establish a wildflower lawn, but wear off in a few months' time for wildflowers to reseed.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So my predecessor, Bob Stamps, did a lot of work with FDOT. I believe it was FDOT, but he did a lot of work with wildflowers. There was another professor that retired from here that did a lot of work with different wildflowers. But so there are some options. So probably the most common thing that's used, there's a herbicide called, people that work just specifically in landscapes probably wouldn't be that familiar with it, but it can be used in right of ways and things like that. But there's a herbicide called Plateau, which is a mazapic that can be used for wildflower establishment. And then there's also some pre-emergence herbicides that can be used. So I know there's several, I believe there's several wildflowers on the Metolachlor label, which is sold as Pendant Magnum and several other trade names. And then there's several others, just kind of species specific, which is the challenge with ornamentals is it's going to be difficult depending upon the wildflower mix. You can probably find a herbicide that could work. But it really just depends upon what all species that you're trying to sow. In general, larger seeded wildflowers and larger seeded seeds aren't as sensitive to herbicides as the smaller seeded. That's just kind of a general rule of thumb that you might think of. So it really is species dependent. But with a lot of these pre-emergence herbicides, they're not gonna last very long, depending upon the rate that's used. They can be applied at pretty low rates, and within 8-10 weeks in Florida, you have a lot of that herbicide has already degraded, depending upon the active, and so you would probably be fine, depending upon when that reseeding needed to occur. So that is a method that's been looked at and been found to be successful in a lot of cases.
All right, one last question. There's still a bunch of questions. Folks, we're going to have to cut it off and go to our next speaker, but we will follow up with a blog post on this and hopefully address all these questions. Chris is easy to find. Google Chris Marble, IFAS, MREC, you can find him. One last question, Chris. So there's this perception, and there's a couple questions in the chat that are sort of related to this perception or feeling that landscape companies use a lot of chemicals. I guess what's your feeling? Is that true? Or because we heard from our industry panel that no, they're using as little as possible, targeting and spot spraying and so forth.
Exactly. Yeah. So the talk, I believe it was from general, I'm blanking on his
Massey,
name.
Adam
Massey.
Jones, yeah.
Yeah, so the stuff. So he made a great point that they don't want to use these chemicals. So they're basically using as little as, or at least a lot of companies, the ones that are doing it the right way, are using as little chemical as possible to achieve the desired result. You know, they've got to. They don't want to spend the money for these chemicals, so they don't want to apply it. So, but then they also have to, you know, they're targeting weeds, insects, and diseases as well. So, you know, that does require different pesticides and things like that. But they're not wanting to go out and apply a lot of pesticides. That costs them. That costs them money. And I really liked what the gentleman from Massey was talking about when he was talking about the fact that they started that irrigation. They started offering irrigation services and things like that. And he was talking about a lot of the benefits that they found from a water saving standpoint. And I was only able to catch probably the tail end of that presentation and wasn't able to ask any questions. But I was curious as terms of what benefits that they've seen from that in terms of a disease pressure and weed pressure and insect pressure too, just pest pressure in general. What benefits that they had observed from that when they had control of that irrigation. So a lot of the times when they have to go out and use maybe different or a lot of pesticides, it might be due to the fact that some of these companies don't have control of those maintenance things. And so they're kind of fighting an uphill battle. Poor soils that they're dealing with, someone mowing too low or applying too much irrigation, et cetera. So all those things play into that. But yeah, they're going to try to get away with as little chemical use as possible because they're not cheap, especially the newer chemistries.
Yeah. Great. Well, thanks very much, Chris. Imagine a room of well over 100 people raving and clapping and cheering you on. So thank you very much for that.
I will think of that. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Next up, Dr. Kenworthy. The floor is yours. You're muted, Kevin, by the way.
Yeah, I know. I can't, well, sorry, I didn't realize I was muted, but I'm struggling to see the whole Zoom thing so that I can, there we go. I hit a button that I didn't know I hit. And now I need to share.
Looks good.
Okay. Everybody can see the right screen?
Yep, looks good.
All right, I appreciate the opportunity to, I need to move us. Appreciate the opportunity to share with you a little bit. I changed the title a little bit from what Emily sent out. I think the title had turf and landscapes, and well, I forgot to update my title on the next slide, as you'll see. But anyway, you know, turf is really part of the lawn, not the total landscape. And what I focus on are the lawns. So I changed the title to reflect lawns. And she put in there what I originally told her. So it's not Emily's fault, it's my fault. But anyway, if you notice the change. And then because I'm going to talk about some things that aren't turf grasses, I just shortened the title to Breeding for Our Future Lawns. So, and then FYI, the background you're looking at, this happens to be CitraBlue in a development down in Naples. And if you don't know what CitraBlue is, you will in a minute. So today we're going to talk about 3 conventional species: St. Augustine grass, Zoysia grass, Bahia grass. We won't talk about Bermuda grass since it's not used very much at all in Florida in lawns. It is in other states, but not so much in Florida. And then I'm going to finish up kind of talking about this topic that's really related to the excellent presentation given last week by Basil and Wendy on the biodiverse ground covers, or you could call use as mixed lawn species, as I'm referring to it here. So anyway, with that, we'll get started. We'll jump right into the program. So this is my current group, and Michael asked or made a comment when he was introducing me earlier that he wasn't sure if I only did turfgrass, and in fact, I don't only do turfgrass. We have or oversee the nation's most prominent breeding program in forage annual ryegrass. There have been about 30 varieties released from the University of Florida over the last 25 to 30 years. I inherited this program from my predecessor, Dr. Gordon Prine. Dr. Prine, for those of you who are interested in perennial peanut, is the person that developed and released EcoTurf perennial peanut many, many years ago as well. So I can't say enough about this group of people here. Most of these, even the undergraduates, have been with me for more than 2 years. They accomplish a whole lot. I'm down to one graduate student right now, so Jose gets the biggest picture. Hopefully many of you know Dr. Ken Quesenberry, retired forage breeder, been working for me now for 10 years and has about a 45-year association with the University of Florida. So goals, right? Pretty impressive. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention so many of my colleagues at the University of Florida that I work with, and left Michael Dukes off of this list accidentally, Michael, so you should be there as well. And then we're currently searching for a new plant physiologist in the agronomy department. Previously worked with John Erickson quite extensively. John Erickson left last July for a position with the USDA, and we hope to fill that in relatively near future. And then this project here, funded by the USDA, involves these 5 institutions and about 25 to 30 other scientists, all working towards the breeding and improvement of turf grasses. So when you include those other institutions and individuals, and then their people like I have over here, there's quite an extensive effort at improving warm season grasses for use in lawns and sports fields. So the first thing we're going to look at is CitraBlue St. Augustine grass. See the parents here. That's not really too important there. 2 experimentals were crossed and resulted in this hybrid that we now know as CitraBlue. The objectives for the breeding at the time were improved drought response, disease resistance, and shade tolerance. And so if we look at this Venn diagram before us, we have the left part of the Venn diagram includes all of these institutions and breeding for improved drought responses in warm season grasses. That's the focus of this collaborative multi-institutional effort. So we want to reduce the amount of water that you're having to apply to maintain the turf in your landscape. And we're accomplishing that. We have several grasses that have been released by several of these institutions that have been in association with this project. And then, of course, the other part of the Venn diagram, we want to have good adaptability to Florida. So we look at a lot of traits in Florida and test all over the state. And ultimately, the goal is that we're finding those experimental lines that cross over both circles, and we want to then select those. And that led to the release of CitraBlue in 2017 and its commercialization in 2018. It was released as FSA 1602 and then commercialized in 2018. This last part of the slide here, sorry, I do lots of scribbling. It helps to slow me down. But you can be rest assured that the turfgrass releases from the University of Florida, they're more scrutinized than any other horticultural release that comes out of the university. CitraBlue alone was in 28 different trials over the course of about 7 to 8 years and at 13 different locations across the Southeast. Most of these locations would have been in the state of Florida. And I'll show you a little bit of data. We're not going to do a lot of data here. These are turfgrass quality ratings from the NTEP program. NTEP stands for National Turfgrass Evaluation Program, which is a national organization that allows turfgrass breeding programs to test their experimental lines at many locations across the country. So it's a very valuable program. And what you're seeing here are results from a trial that was planted in 2016. And this trial has about 20 entries. I'm only showing you CitraBlue and the other commercial cultivars in the trial. And we're showing you 2019 data from the Florida locations. There are two locations at the Fort Lauderdale REC, and then one with Dr. Unruh up at J Florida at the West Florida REC. And the values in the table are turf quality ratings, which are visual ratings from 1 to 9, where 9 is a perfect plot, 1 is a dead plot, and 6, anything above 6 would be considered acceptable. So you see that down at Fort Lauderdale, most of the ratings were above 6, but CitraBlue outperformed all other entries in the top statistical group. And at the West Florida REC, again, CitraBlue was the lone entry in the top statistical group, and Floratam and Raleigh were actually below an acceptable value for 2019. So when you're using these yearly means, just remember that that's an average across all months of the year. So if something has a mean that's a little bit low, it's probably doing a little worse through the winter, and probably did really good through the summer. Of course, not much of a winter at Fort Lauderdale, so the averages are pretty high down there. But nonetheless, you see that CitraBlue has done very well in Florida, very well adapted to the state. Related to that project with all the institutions looking at water use and drought responses, this is again some data that's showing CitraBlue in comparison to 2 other commercial cultivars, Floratam and Palmetto. These are the 2 dominant cultivars in the state of Florida. And we have once a week irrigation and then once a month irrigation. And again, the 1 to 9 scale, where anything above 6 would be considered acceptable quality. And you see that for the most part, CitraBlue had better quality during this period of rating. This is 2018 to 2019. And this was for the most part a wet period, particularly during the summer months. We did have a few dry periods here and there, and you can see some dips in the turf quality. But overall, CitraBlue much better than Floratam and Palmetto, and did very well at these different irrigation frequencies. And so this last table is kind of a summary of what we know about CitraBlue. And so we see CitraBlue here, and then we have these listing of traits as you go across the top row. So we know it has good turf quality. We've documented good drought response for CitraBlue. It really, one of its selling points for the landscape is the aesthetic value. It has a really unique blue-green color. We've been able to document that it can be mowed half as much as Floratam and still maintain really good quality. So if it's raining and you skip a mowing, you're not baling hay the next time you get out and mow like you might have to with Floratam. Weed control has been very similar to Floratam and Palmetto, so no surprises. One of the things we really like about CitraBlue is its combination of resistance to some of the most important diseases that affect St. Augustine grass. It's very good against large patch. It will get a little bit. It's not quite as resistant as Floratam. When it does get it, it's kind of it's a minimal infection, and it will outgrow that in time. And again, we've not seen very much take-all root rot on CitraBlue, and it's very resistant to gray leaf spot, particularly compared to Floratam, which is extremely susceptible to gray leaf spot. And the reason why I really like the disease package here is I think we lose more turfgrass, St. Augustine grass in this state to disease infection than we do to water or any other issue. When we get those rainy months with very little sunlight, lots of cloud cover, the disease pressure is just excessive, and we lose a lot of turf because of that. We have seen a little bit of brown patch occur on CitraBlue, and brown patch is the form of Rhizoctonia solani that occurs in the summer months, typically occurs on cool season grasses, and large patch occurs on warm season grasses. But we have seen a little bit on CitraBlue in the warm months, and it doesn't cause a lot of issues. We're going to talk about lethal viral necrosis in a few minutes. CitraBlue has excellent shade tolerance. Dr. Dell's done some chinch bug work for us. It's not resistant to chinch bugs. They will damage CitraBlue, but we think that it is less susceptible than some of the other grasses on the market. So that's just a single check mark because we don't have we need more evidence about the chinch bug response. And then one of the biggest concerns for CitraBlue is that the caterpillars during the rainy season really do like CitraBlue. I don't know if the adults are attracted to the color of the plant, but for some reason we can get some excessive populations. And so you need to be careful, particularly when planting sod during the rainy months of the year when the caterpillar populations can explode. And I would really recommend that if you're working with CitraBlue, that you are proactive and use preventative applications to prevent caterpillar outbreaks because they can be quite devastating. They've been devastating across the industry on all cultivars the last couple of years, but I just want to make sure people are aware of this when they're planting CitraBlue to be proactive. Winter color is a little bit of a knock with CitraBlue, particularly as you're in Gainesville and further north. Some of the other varieties on the market hold color a little bit better. Of course, that's not so much of an issue further south. So just a few landscape pictures. This is down in Palm Beach County, CitraBlue doing quite well. This is in the central part of the state near Lakeland. This landscape happens to be more than a year old and doing quite well in extensive shade. And just to show some diversity, this is a backyard up in Tifton, Georgia that looks really nice planted in CitraBlue. Lethal viral necrosis. And so this is kind of a step away from CitraBlue because this is an important topic to talk about when we're talking about St. Augustine grass in Florida. And pay attention to this top statement here. Sugarcane mosaic virus causes 2 diseases. This is one thing I want you to realize. There's some lack of good information out there on this. Sugarcane mosaic virus causes 2 diseases in St. Augustine grass. One disease is called mosaic, and a new disease is called lethal viral necrosis. So mosaic occurs on all cultivars of St. Augustine grass. It's been around for 60 years. It's not an important disease. It's very likely that many landscapes have mosaic and they don't even know it, and you're not even concerned about it. It's a non-factor. However, in recent years in Floratam, symptoms of mosaic are progressing to necrosis and can lead to loss of the lawn, hence the name lethal viral necrosis. To date, no other cultivar of St. Augustine grass has been confirmed for LVN. Floratam remains a good option for many areas of the state. Why is that? Because LVN is not a factor in many areas of the state. We don't have any confirmed case of LVN north of Pinellas County. It tends to be coastal on the east and west coast portions of the state for whatever reason. It is continuing to spread in those regions, but again, LVN is not a factor in many areas of the state. No sod farms have been confirmed as a source of LVN. Well, there are 2 new St. Augustine grasses on the market, Provista and CitraBlue. Both have been planted in LVN affected landscapes. However, we need more time for assessment of these landscapes to know how these new grasses respond, either to be infected or to be resistant against infection. Okay, so moving on to something new that you likely have not heard of, CitraZoy. This is a new Zoysia grass. You see the parents, this is also a hybrid, and the objectives for this were improved winter color, disease resistance, drought response, and shade tolerance. And again, the same process. It was also involved in this multi-institutional collaborative effort for screening for drought responses. And CitraZoy was released from UF in 2019 and really just recently commercialized in 2020. So it's going to be a while before this is out on the market, but it's good to let people be aware of what's coming. Remember, this is about the future of lawns in Florida. CitraZoy has been trialed to date in 38 trials at 23 locations across many states across the US, even into California and Arizona. And these are a couple of landscape images of CitraZoy in Gainesville. These were installed in March of 2018, and this is a more recent image of this same area, but from June of 2020. So doing quite nicely in this landscape in Gainesville. Oops. And oops, this is another image of CitraZoy planted in Southeast Florida. Characteristics, it has a medium fine texture. It definitely looks different than any Zoysia grass on the market in Florida. It has excellent sod strength, so that's a win for the sod producers and for installers who are handling sod. Compared to Empire, it has better winter color retention, better shade tolerance, and we have never seen large patch occur on CitraZoy. Large patch is one of the most problematic issues in Zoysia grass, and we have yet to seen it occur on CitraZoy, and we've been working with this plant for more than 10 years. That doesn't mean that as acres increase with sod growers and more homes get planted and it's in and it's grown in different environments, that doesn't mean that large patch won't then occur, but to date, we have not observed it. So to summarize with CitraBlue and CitraZoy, CitraBlue is now in 4 states, licensed to 20 producers. We have about 500 acres planted. It is readily available in Florida. We hope to have about 1,000 acres planted by the end of the year. And there are 5 licensed producers and 14 acres planted so far of CitraZoy. Again, it's going to be probably a year and a half, maybe 2 years before this is actually on the market. But when you're involved in these things with the marketing companies, you wind up being the only IFAS employee with your own baseball card. So I'm going to sign this for everybody. And that way, you know, you can take that with you as you leave the presentation today. So anyway, I catch a lot of grief for having that baseball card, but there it is. Okay, so just because we have these releases doesn't mean the breeding program stops. It certainly progresses, and so we can look even further into the future. This is a newer trial that was planted in 2018. It includes CitraBlue, it includes Floratam, it includes Palmetto, and it includes many new experimental hybrids that we've produced. And these are all showing really good promise. What you're looking at, again, are turf quality ratings at 2 different locations, averaged between 2019 and 2020. And I'm really excited about this particular line 1810. And we're going to go ahead, and because of the LVN issue in South Florida and all the unknowns, we're going to try to be aggressive and begin to test some of these lines with sod growers. It's important for us to be ahead of the progression of the disease and have new options for the industry. And same thing with Zoysia grass. Even though CitraZoy is recently released, we have many new things in the pipeline. In this particular graph, there's CitraZoy, and then there are 3 commercial cultivars that are all produced in Florida. And you're looking at turf quality ratings and fall dormancy ratings averaged through 2020. This is a pretty young trial. But again, we have some experimentals here that are doing really well and warrant further investigation into the future. So the breeding program doesn't stop. And so on to Bahia grass. Everybody would love to have an improved Bahia grass for turf use. So objectives for aesthetically increased aesthetic value Bahia grass are darker green, denser, and some type of change in the seed heads. Can we reduce the number of seed heads? Can we make them shorter so they're not so visible? And what about changing their window of emergence? Instead of having Bahia grass seed heads from April to October, could we narrow that window from June to August maybe, so that we're not always mowing seed heads in Bahia grass? It really is the #1 deterrent in the use of Bahia grass in improved landscapes. There's a lot of management to go mow those seed heads. So what you're looking at here with these images are this, let's just say this would be conventional seed head heights in Bahia grass. And modeling there for us are myself and Dr. Unruh. And the take-home message here is that you don't want me or Dr. Unruh modeling for you. I think that should be obvious after this. But look at one of our developed lines over here. This is a mutant Bahia grass that we developed through inducing mutations. And you see the short dark green color. The canopy is barely up just over our feet. And so reduced mowing, better color, better density in this particular Bahia grass. And in this 10 by 10 foot plot, ignore this contamination over here of another Bahia grass plant. And in this 10 by 10 foot plot, there'd be about 5 seed heads, and they wouldn't be any taller than about 7 or 8 inches. So shorter seed heads, fewer seed heads. The problem with that is that you're not going to have seed production of these. And so we're working with sod growers and have been trying to work with sod growers now for several years to see if we can't produce and get these things out onto the market. And we've had some issues with that, not really grass related, but just more or less where they've been placed on the property of the respective sod growers. Those locations just haven't worked out real well. In the meantime, we've planted plots, and the presenters last week talked about the challenges of planting plugs, and I certainly hear them. We plant thousands of plugs every year, and it is labor intensive. And these were some hot days in August that we planted these plugs. And anyway, so we've planted these on golf courses in South Florida, in out-of-way areas. Golf courses are increasing their use of Bahia grass. Although Bahia grass, because it prefers a lower pH, is not ideally suited for use in some of these areas in South Florida because of the higher pHs. So we're hoping to screen these as part of these evaluations to see if some aren't better suited for use in South Florida due to the pH issues. And this is the grown-in plots at Royal Poinciana in Naples. Okay, so before I get into this, I just want to kind of make a comment that I hope you recognize that everything we're doing with the conventional species is about increasing the sustainability of the industry. We admittedly may not meet all metrics that everybody wants to see, such as diversity in a lawn, but certainly we can check the boxes for reducing inputs, where we have better disease resistance, insect resistance in some cases. And so that's fewer pesticides. The major goal of our program is to reduce and eliminate the need to irrigate your turf grass in your lawn. And we're making progress on that. And that certainly increases the sustainability of our industry and makes our industry more profitable as well. But that doesn't mean that I can't get excited about mixed species lawns as well. Quite frankly, this sort of concept is a plant breeder's dream. You know, I live for working with different species and trying to see what type of variation is out there. And that's what gets me excited when I get to go to the field. So certainly there is room for different types of lawns in our Florida landscapes. And you're looking at a picture just outside my office of a somewhat dormant Bahia grass lawn that has a lot of black medic and white clover in it. And so, but what I want to do when I go through this is to challenge everybody to kind of consider some things that I don't think have been considered when we've had some of these discussions very well. And that is, do you want to see this take off so that, you know, there's 2 or 3 or 4 homes in these developments that put in these mixed species lawns? Or do you want every home to adopt these practices? And if mixed species lawns are the way to go, then let's be on board with this and let's get every lawn to be planted. But there's some things that we need to challenge ourselves when we look at these species and consider them. Not every species is going to fit for what we want. It can't be the plant that we like so much, or the one that's the prettiest or has the best flowers. It's the plants that we can produce, and we can produce economically, that are going to make it for wide scale utilization. And I'd like to see more conversation, more discussion, more thought given to the production of these species. How are they delivered? Because number one, they've got to be profitable for the growers. And then stride for stride with that, they've got to be affordable for the consumer. A grower may be able to make it profitable for himself, but it then may not be affordable for the consumer. And you've got to have both. Next, they have to be easily produced as sod or seed, and they have to be easy and economical to install. Can't be backbreaking to install. It can't cost too much to install. So we're going to move these forward onto the next slide over here with the goal and the production components. And we're going to say these are must-haves as we consider breeding and developing and commercializing mixed species for use in our lawns. And there are other things that I will say are desirable. Okay, these aren't necessarily must-haves, but they're desirable when we can make considerations for these species. A spreading growth habit is preferred, so there's ebb and flow between species. Perennials, I do think, are preferred. That helps with weed control, although there is room for annuals, and I'll mention some annuals. They need to tolerate sun and shade, and preferably species that have the ability to tolerate both. You could have different mixes that are in the shade from the sun, but it would be good to have species that go back and forth. They need to tolerate traffic. They need to tolerate frequent mowing. It's not going to work if we're relying on these plants to reseed themselves and they have to be unmown for a month in order for mature seed to drop. Well, then that's not a lawn. You're talking about a meadow in your yard or a prairie in your yard. And if that's your goal, great, that's fine. But if we're talking about a lawn, then we're talking about something that is frequently mown. There's a utility to a lawn, there's activity taking place, and so plants need to tolerate frequent mowing. Alongside that, they need to flower and set seed under a range of mowing heights. This is a must for annuals if you're going to incorporate annuals into these mixed species lawns. Irrigation needs, well, frankly, we don't want to water. And I think that they showed last week that the best approaches are a mix of grasses and forbs, and certainly that gives you more diversity in that lawn. And also would be ideal to have species that can grow both in the warmer months and cooler months. You don't want a situation where the warm season species die off or go dormant, and then you have a nitrogen flush through that system. You need another plant there that can take over during the cooler months and grow and take up the nutrients that are still in the soil. These plants need to be persistent to avoid sudden absences of cover, and we hope there aren't pest issues, but you can bet, and this is another thing that needs to be considered, as these plants get increased and used on a much wider scale, there are going to be pest problems that we haven't anticipated. Why are there so many pest issues in turfgrass? Because it's on hundreds of thousands of acres. It's out there, so the pests are out there. And that's going to happen no matter what species we use. If it's going to be increasingly used, then the pest problems are going to increase, and we need to anticipate those and be ahead of it. We hope that these species are attractive to pollinators. And you may have honed in on why I said produced as sod or seed. Why not plugs? Well, let's just consider two species that I think have tremendous merit for mixed species lawns, and that's frog fruit and mimosa. And I found a Florida nursery online that's selling these at $3 per 4-inch plug. I didn't do an exhaustive search. Hopefully you can find them cheaper and in smaller plug sizes. In comparison, you can buy plugs of St. Augustine grass for about 2 1/4 per 3-inch plug. St. Augustine grass is sold in an 18 plug tray. You plant that on wood foot center, and it's going to cost $41 to plant those 18 square feet. Bump that up to 1,000 square feet, and you're spending over $2,000. Comparatively, with the frog fruit and mimosa at $3 a plug, same planting rate, you're looking at $3,000 to plant 1,000 square feet. This is cost prohibitive. Let's look at sod. A whopping 1/4 cents per square foot. Depending on the variety, sod may be less than 20 cents or up to 35 cents per square feet. I'd love it if CitraBlue were sold at 25 cents a square foot. And so that with a 400 square foot pallet, that's $100. And let's go ahead and add in freight and installation of that pallet, and you're looking at about $225 for an installed 400 square foot area. Bump that up to an installed 1,000 square feet, and we're at $562. We've only bought the plant material over here. It hasn't been installed yet, and we've spent thousands of dollars. This is a no-go, okay? And we have to have production practices and suitable for production practices for these species to take off and be widely used. And the other moral of the story is, don't purchase trays of St. Augustine grass. It's cost prohibitive. Buy some sod and buy a machete and start swinging and make your own plugs. Okay, so I am not a plant materials expert. So given these mixed lawns, mixed species lawns, I've jotted down several species here. Some of these are grasses, and that's obviously where my knowledge base comes from, but I've mentioned several other forbs here and some clovers to go along with this. And I mentioned whether they're perennial, spreading, native, and are they available as sod or seed, okay? And you see some yeses and nos, and some that are yes for both sod and seed, like Bahia grass. And then carpet grass is a no for sod in our market, but a yes for seed. And then you see some of these that we might be interested in that are a no for sod and a no for seed. So this is another point that when do we want to make an impact with mixed species lawns? And hopefully sooner than later, right? And so there are species listed here that are commercially available, produced at levels that are suitable to move these into testing and evaluation and planting of mixed species of lawns. These three grasses certainly qualify. It's hard to go anywhere in the state and not find all three of these growing together: Bahia grass, carpet grass, and centipede grass. These are very suitable for this process and available now commercially so that they could be purposefully planted in this manner. White clover can be purchased commercially in the state and planted. You can find seed of dichondra online, and it doesn't seem to be too excessively overpriced. I mean, it is overpriced, but you could buy it, and it could be included in a low percentage of these mixed species lawns. And then perennial peanut is also extremely expensive as sod and grows very slowly, but could be included in a low percentage in these mixed lawns. And given time, it will grow in and spread. All of these others with no's, it doesn't mean that they're not suitable for this concept. It means there's work to do. And a lot of these you can find seed at a specialty nursery, but getting 30 seed or a gram of seed from a nursery is not going to cut it right now. We need commercial production. So I'm trying to highlight some of these species where it's feasible now, and it's recognized that there's work to be done to get to better production practices for some of these other species that we might be interested in. And so that's where a breeding program can come in. And so what are we already doing? We're already working on Bahia grass, as you've seen. We've always worked on centipede grass. I've been working on carpet grass for more than 15 years. And we have a small carpet grass breeding program. This is a seed head of tropical carpet grass, and this is this is a seed head of common carpet grass, and this is a plant of tropical carpet grass. Another option is Sporobulus virginicus, the common name seashore drop seed. This is native to Florida, extremely salt tolerant. You can find it as plugs. But again, I've been planting this in plots and various trials for about 10 years. What you're looking here is an experiment that is a low maintenance trial, and this plot's not cutting it, right? You see the weed, it's disintegrating and the weeds are overtaking. This is Sporobulus right here. Most people that would look at it would think that it's probably common Bermuda grass, but it makes a really nice stand of turf. And it could be a native option for use in these mixed species landscapes. But there are production questions that have to be answered for Sporobulus. I have a lot of questions there, and we have a lot of answers that we need to dig into. And we're initiating programs as well based on some things that we think might work. And one of those is a grass related to Bahia grass. Bahia grass is Paspalum notatum. And this is thin Paspalum cetaceum. It's a bunch grass. It's not spreading, but I'm interested in it because it's a native to Florida and it has really good shade tolerance. And you see a seed head. We can easily produce seed of this. These are several pots grown together. They make a nice sward. And the other thing we're doing is that we're trying to hybridize thin Paspalum with Bahia grass. This is Bahia grass here with its really tall seed head, and thin Paspalum up here with a shorter seed head. We've bagged them, and we're trying to get pollen transfer from thin Paspalum into Bahia grass. So this is a wide hybrid, and then we have to use embryo rescue to hopefully germinate the seedlings. And if we could get some shade tolerance bred into Bahia grass, then that would be a terrific product for the industry. Frog fruit. We've been making some local collections of frog fruit. I've been interested in this plant since 20 years ago, living in Texas and seeing this grow on hard-packed, baked, 100-degree temperature soils, and it persisting and surviving, and then coming to Florida and see it thriving in such a wet environment as well. There's got to be a greater use for this species. And you see one of them we've bagged here to see if we can self it. We wanted to see how easy it is to get seed off of this plant and then get seedlings. And we have very easily been able to obtain seedlings from frog fruit. So there's potential if we can harvest these small flowers to have seed production. It grows so well, it may even be a possibility of sod production. There's lots of things that need to be investigated. And then along the clovers, you can't have Dr. Quesenberry in your lab and not think about clovers. This is his license plate, and he's a world-renowned clover expert. And this is Dr. Rios, our newer forage breeder, and he and I have talked about white clover and working on that. And you can actually buy micro clover commercially, and micro clover is just a dwarf version of white clover out on the market. But we could develop one from UF as well. And I asked Dr. Quesenberry to give me a list of different clovers that might be suitable. And he gave me 3 or 4 that would be suitable. One that I included here is Carolina clover. This is an annual low-growing clover that is a native to Florida. So there are options out there. Mimosa is very interesting to me as well, but you got to draw the line somewhere with these projects and things that you can have resources to take on. But nonetheless, I think there's a lot of work to be done. There's things that we can do now that are already adequately produced that we can have an impact with these mixed species lawns. And then there are things that we need to work on collectively as a group to bring these to market in the future. And I think we can all say that we're, we don't want nitrogen or any other nutrient to escape. We don't want algae blooms to occur, that we're all in it for the sustainability, not only of our man-made horticultural ecosystems, but also our natural ecosystems as well. And we need to be protecting those as best as we can. So with that, I'll finish it up. Hopefully I didn't take too long, but if there's any questions, I can take some of those. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Kevin. Just imagine 100 people applauding and cheering. Because they are. Let's get to some questions. We're going to go a little over just to hit some of these questions because I think this is really good stuff, and we've got most of the audience still engaged. So let's go ahead and hit some of these. Can you stay around a little bit, Kevin?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry if I went long.
You're good.
I practiced, I was pretty close to the mark. So
you're good. I stole some of your time at the very beginning, so it's on me. All right. So the first question from Alice Brockway: does Citra Zoy need a special mower? What's the mowing frequency, water use?
No special mower needed. We do recommend from IFAS that all Zoysia grasses be mowed no higher than 2 inches. The shorter, the better, but a rotary mower is perfectly fine for the mowing heights that these need to be mowed in our landscapes. On the water side of Citra Zoy, it's a little bit different. As I mentioned, it went through the multi-institutional evaluations in all these different environments for drought responses. Most zoysia grasses will wilt quickly in the landscape. Along with that, they can generally tolerate that period without additional moisture for a long time, which is a great attribute. Citrazoy is a little bit different. It tends to not wilt as quickly, which is nice because wilting should be a sign to go water your lawn, right? That's when you need to water, wait for it to wilt. So if Citrazoy can hold that off for another day or two or a week, given the conditions, then you're conserving water. But with Citrazoy, it doesn't persist through those periods as well as some of the other zoysia grasses on the market. It can decline pretty quickly. Once you wilt and move to leaf firing, you need to water Citrazoy. But again, that's a good indication to the homeowner of when they actually should be watering. And wilting should be we should be able to educate people to easily recognize the symptoms of wilt. So it has a favorable attribute in that it can last a little bit longer without a decline, but once you see that decline, it doesn't persist through that as well as some of the other varieties on the market. So that would be an indication that you do need to get some water on there. But if you've been able to go a day or two longer, maybe it's rained by then in many of the areas of the state. So
very good. Recognizing that a lot of the work you've done is related to water conservation, maybe disease resistance. Is there breeding work going on to address cultivars, or I'm probably using the wrong words, new grasses that have lower nutrient demands?
Right. So
fertilizer.
I mentioned that we haven't specifically or quantitatively evaluated our experimental lines for their nutrient use. It's kind of an indirect objective of the breeding program in that we try to limit the fertilizer that we apply to our plots. So we're picking those and moving those lines forward that are doing well under the management that we have them under, which is minimal. That said, centipede grass that we have we do a little bit of work on is known for needing fewer nutrients, Bahia grass as well. And carpet grass is known for requiring fewer nutrients, but we need that in St. Augustine grass. We hope, there's the color of CitraBlue. It has a genetically darker hue to it. So, there's some hope that it may not need as much nitrogen in order to maintain adequate color. And we do have an ongoing trial looking at some fertilization programs in CitraBlue, but we don't have enough data to be conclusive or to show anything yet. And I'd like to get some more trials across the state looking at that as well in CitraBlue.
Great. Question on Bahia grass. This seems like the holy grail of turf. How does it feel under bare feet? Is it sharp or soft? And actually, this was one of my questions about the alternative ground cover as well.
Well, generally when I'm out at the plots, I don't go barefoot. So I guess I can't make the comment on the barefoot part of it, but it's still Bahia grass. It looks prettier, particularly with that picture from a distance, but when you're standing over it, it's still a thinner turf. So you're going to be feeling the soil under your feet for sure. And Bahia grass is a stiffer plant. So be that as it may, it's still Bahia grass. It's a prettier Bahia grass, but it's still Bahia grass. And then to I guess your related question, Michael, on the mixed species, as long as you have dense cover, I can't imagine that, frog fruit's probably pretty comfortable on the feet. Dichondra would definitely be comfortable on the feet. There are beautiful images of monoculture dichondra landscapes online. Let's see, the clovers are, particularly the white clover, will be comfortable on the feet. Now, peanut may be a little bit stiff on the feet, and the mimosa looks a little bit stimmy. I haven't, again, ever tried it. I'm just, guessing here that mimosa might be a little bit stiff on the feet.
Very good. Some comments on the price comparisons, which I thought were really interesting between the alternative landscape and, you pointing out the reality of production. If it's going to be a thing, it's got to be able to be produced
Right.
commercially. So one of our attendees points out that the costs that you have, they look like retail. Wholesale would probably be a little bit cheaper for the plugs.
Well,
but
that's a good point. Those were retail costs, but we're talking about homeowners buying these things. So, and their homeowners making the decisions to put these in their lawns. So,
and not only that, I think your point was, sod is, order of magnitude cheaper than
Yeah.
plugs. Anyway,
yes.
also, actually, AJ points out interesting analysis, economic analysis, but we need a life cycle analysis, over the longer term. If you're putting in less inputs into some of these alternatives, then that's going to save you money over a period of time.
Right. No, I fully agree and knew I would get that question. Good for you, AJ. Yeah.
Let me see.
Part of it.
Any interest in production of, I'm going to go into Latin here, Panicum capillare, short growing witchgrass? Know anything on that?
I don't know anything about that particular Panicum species. And I'm happy to receive some input. If somebody knows of a plant they think might work in these and there could be some breeding work maybe done to bring it to market, then I'm interested in talking to you and learning grasses and forbs, all, anything that might work. It would be interesting to learn and get some plants in and see how they do.
Someone points out here that mimosa has thorns. So probably a no-go on the barefoot. What do you think about a turf border like CitraBlue that blends into frog fruit and leads to under canopy natural plantings?
Sounds like a win to me.
How does CitraBlue do in Miami-Dade County?
It's done really well. We saw the data from the Fort Lauderdale Research and Education Center. That's the closest we've got for anything to Miami. And it's done really well down there. I would recommend that it get a little bit of shade down there. One of the issues with CitraBlue, it grows very horizontal. So if it's in the full sun, you're going to have some thatch. But if there's a little bit of shade, and it doesn't take much shade, it could be simple shade from a fence, from a building, a light canopy tree, then that's going to change the growth habit a little bit. You won't have those thatch issues. But, those issues aren't as prevalent in Gainesville because we have a winter period where the grasses go dormant. There's some decomposition of the thatch. But it's a good question to ask for the southern part of the state where you're growing year round. It will be interesting to see. We're going to learn more now that this plant's out there in production and getting put in landscapes. We're going to learn more pretty quickly about how it does long term. But I've always thought that this plant was not so much of a Floritam replacement, but more of a replacement of bitterblue, palmetto, classic, and Seville, the St. Augustine grasses that are recommended for shade.
Gotcha. So you mentioned that CitraBlue, it can be mown. You could skip a mowing, so you could mow it half as much. That tells me that maybe it has lower ET if it's not growing as fast, which means maybe it needs less irrigation input. Do we know?
We haven't. We have trials in place now that are going to look at some ET. We haven't measured that directly, but that is a terrific, perceptive, common sense question there. That if a plant's growing slower, it should be using less water. It's not always the case. Plant physiology is very complicated, but that is one of our thoughts as well. We haven't been able to quantitatively evaluate that, but we have some things that are going to occur with that over the next year. We have seen CitraBlue wilt less, given the same amount of time, same growing conditions compared to Floritam, which tends to wilt a little bit sooner.
All right, I'm going to wrap it up here with a couple questions. And another attendee points out that Mimosa strigolosa does not have spines or thorns, but it doesn't like shade. So clearly you and I are not experts on mimosa, but
It's pretty.
it is pretty. So here is a question, big picture. We get a lot of rain in Florida, and you know, we don't have the challenges that like the desert Southwest has, where there's just not rain for long periods of time. You have to irrigate. How long till we get to a turf grass here in Florida or the Southeast that we don't need to irrigate? We don't need to add supplemental water because there's enough water naturally. Or will we ever get there?
I think we will. If anybody's attended our field days, they've seen St. Augustine plots that we've had in place. And these are, you know, 200 experimental lines that haven't been watered for 2 years. Now, I need to give a little bit of an asterisk there. They have gotten a little bit of water when we've needed to irrigate in some fertilizer or pre-emergent herbicide. Other than that, they've not received any water. And they wax and wane, you know, they're not beautiful all the time, but they persist and they make it through. And there's periods of the year where they are beautiful. And so I think it is a reality for the future that we will have grasses in our lawns that do not require supplemental irrigation, or at least very, very minimal supplemental irrigation. And that would only be during the driest periods of the year. Up here in Alachua County, that would be during May when we might need to irrigate.
Yep.
I've watered my own home lawn well, from October of 19 to October of 20, I watered 3 times, and that was because I needed to irrigate in fertilizer or pre-emergent. So, but I have some tree canopy as well.
You know, it's what we talked about, soil conditions, culture of putting in irrigation on all new construction. You have poor soil to start out with. It's just this cascade of issues, which is kind of prelude to some of our future speakers who are going to talk about soil amendments. One last question for you though, Kevin. I want to wrap this up so people can get on with their day. Thank you for staying longer. Thank you and Chris for talking today. The last question is this. Now that you have a baseball card, when are we going to get the bobblehead?
If someday we replace Floritan, we'll get some bobbleheads. How about
I'm going to hold you to that. All right, very good. Well, thank everyone for staying on, and we hope to see you next week. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Emily, for keeping us squared away.